I remember the first time I saw him, not as the world would come to know him. No banners, no swastikas, no screaming crowds. Just a boy, thin and pale, in a cramped Austrian house that smelled of ink, leather, and stale smoke. His name was Adolf, and from the beginning something in the room bent toward him, like a shadow leaning over a candle. He was born in Braunau am Inn, a small town pressed against the border, where Austria bleeds into Germany, and people argued over which side they truly belonged to. His father, Alois, was a customs officer, hard, impatient, a man who walked as if the floor had personally offended him. His mother, Clara, was soft-spoken, devout, wrapping her affection around the boy like a blanket he never forgot. I watched him as a child, hunched over a table, sketching buildings with obsessive care, lines too straight for such small hands. Outside, the world was fields and river mist. Inside, the world was fear. His father wanted him to follow rules, uniforms, authority. Adolf wanted to draw. That house was an arena. Alois's voice always came first, sharp, cutting, the sound that made everyone else smaller. Sometimes Adolf would talk back, eyes burning with a defiance too big for his age. It never ended well. The slap would come fast, ringing through the room. His mother would stand in the doorway, fingers knotted in her apron, torn between the man she feared and the child she worshipped. If you listened carefully, you could hear the fracture forming, this boy, caught between tenderness and brutality, pride and humiliation. He learned early that power was the only language some people respected. He never forgot that lesson. When his father died, it wasn't as dramatic as you might imagine. No thunder, no final curse, just a sudden absence. One day there was a tyrant in the house. The next day there was a void. You might think that would free Adolf. It didn't. The ghost of his father followed him into school, into arguments with teachers, into the way he couldn't stand to be corrected. Every criticism was an insult, every failure a conspiracy. He moved with his mother, drifted through classrooms, sat in the back, barely passing, then not passing at all. He refused the idea of a normal job the way a man refuses poison. He clung to art instead, the one thing that made him feel special, chosen. Above the gray masses he despised even then, he pictured himself in Vienna, the great imperial capital, standing before canvases, discussing light and color with other artists who would finally see him. He did make it to Vienna, but not the way he dreamed. I followed him into that city like following a man into a storm. Vienna was loud, crowded, beautiful, and cruel. Trams clattered along wide avenues. Palaces cast their long shadows over tenements, coughing up smoke. Here languages mixed and clashed. Germans, Czechs, Jews, Slavs, rich and poor, all stacked together in a restless empire that felt both grand and rotten. He submitted his art school portfolio, his buildings, his carefully drawn facades. No people, no faces, just stone and symmetry, rejected, not once, twice. They told him he lacked talent. He told himself they couldn't see it. But rejection is a seed. Under the right conditions, it grows into something poisonous. He rented cheap rooms, then cheaper, sold postcard sketches to tourists, ate badly, slept worse. Winter pressed its cold fingers into his bones. He haunted the men's hostels and soup kitchens, where bitterness was the common language. There in those smoky rooms, he discovered something more intoxicating than art ideology. He listened to men rant about politics, race, the decline of the empire. He devoured newspapers that dripped with nationalism and resentment. He absorbed conspiracy theories like a dry sponge soaks up spilled poison. The idea that Germans were the true people. That others, Jews, Slavs, socialists, were parasites, traitors, threats. He began to believe that his own failure was not his fault. It was theirs. The more powerless he felt in his own life, the more he dreamed of a power vast enough to reshape entire nations. That contradiction is where monsters are born. And then, as if the world wanted to reflect his inner chaos, the Great War came. He volunteered eagerly, as if the army were a stage meant only for him. He joined the Bavarian regiment, wore the uniform like a second skin, marched with other men who believed glory still existed in the modern world. At first, he was happy. War gave him structure, rank, a place. Orders replaced uncertainty. Discipline replaced drift. He ran messages through mud and shellfire with a fanatic's devotion. Some found him strange, intense. isolated, more married to the idea of Germany than to any living soul. But the war was no noble crusade. I watched him stand in trenches where the world had turned into an open grave, mud up to the knees. Rats fat with human flesh, bodies twisted into the wire, gas that rolled in like a yellow-green ghost, searing lungs, turning men into clawing animals desperate for one more breath. He saw comrades shredded beside him, blown apart mid-sentence. He saw entire offensives collapse, not in heroic charges, but in confusion, screams, and sudden silence. When the news came that Germany had lost, there was no enemy soldier standing over him with a sword raised. No dramatic defeat. Just papers, signatures, armistice. The war ended with a sentence, not a shot. For him, it felt like a betrayal. He had given everything to the idea of the fatherland, and now politicians in suits, men he already despised, declared it over. The home front, he was told, had grown weak. Traitors, Jews, Marxists, they'd stabbed Germany in the back. He clung to that myth like a life raft, because the alternative, that he had bled and almost died for nothing, was unthinkable. When the war spat him out again, Germany was not the country he thought he had fought for. The Kaiser was gone. The streets were filled with protests, flags of new ideas, new parties, new enemies. Inflation devoured savings. Veterans limped past shop windows, displaying luxuries they could never afford. The Weimar Republic was born into chaos. He could have vanished then. Just another disillusioned veteran lost in the noise. Instead, he walked into a small meeting of a tiny political group one evening, the German Workers' Party. A handful of men. Barely organized, but he listened. They spoke of resentment, national humiliation, hatred for Marxists and Jews, dreams of a reborn Germany. The words were crude, but they hit the same nerve that had been throbbing inside him since Vienna. And then he spoke. I was there when he first stood up in that smoky beer hall, his voice rough but rising, his hands slicing the air like blades. At first, people laughed, then they went silent. Then they leaned in. He was not just a man speaking. He was a wound roaring. He poured out his frustration, his rage, his longing for a pure, powerful Germany. He painted enemies everywhere. He made complex problems feel simple, solvable, if only they were removed. He didn't have wealth, education, or status. But he had anger, and anger is contagious, the party noticed. They gave him more time to speak, more people to reach. He became their star attraction, the man who could turn a boardroom into a fevered storm. Soon the German Workers' Party was reshaped into something new. New name, new symbol, new myth, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. He had finally found his canvas, not with paint. With people, propaganda became his brush, posters, slogans, banners, uniforms. Every rally was a performance. Flags in blood-red rows, torches burning against the night, marching boots echoing off ancient stones. He understood something deep and dangerous. Most people don't want nuance. They want certainty. He gave them that certainty, wrapped in spectacle. The beer hall putsch was his first attempt to seize power by force. Munich, 1923, I remember the smell of spilled beer, sweat, and gunpowder. He and his followers stormed into a political meeting, trying to hijack the state of Bavaria with raw intimidation. He believed that his sheer will, his quaking self-belief, could overturn a government in a single night. He was wrong. Shots were fired. Men fell. The coup collapsed as fast as it had begun. He fled, then was arrested, dragged from his fantasy of instant revolution back into the cold, gray world of consequences. But even in defeat, he found opportunity. His trial was no ordinary trial. It became a stage. He stood before the judges, not as a criminal, but as a self-proclaimed patriot. He ranted, justified, reframed the attempted coup as a noble effort to save Germany. Newspapers reported his speeches. His name spread beyond Munich, beyond Bavaria. He went to prison and used the bars as lines on a page. In Landsberg prison, he dictated a book, a tangled web of autobiography, venom, prophecy, and delusion, Mein Kampf. There, he laid out his worldview, racial hierarchy, hatred of Jews, contempt for democracy, hunger for expansion. The ideas were extreme, but they were clear. The book was a blueprint, a warning. and almost no one took it seriously. That was their mistake. When he emerged, he changed tactics. No more failed coups. Now, he would use the system he despised to destroy it from within. Germany staggered through hyperinflation, then brief recovery, then the Great Depression. Millions unemployed, despair rising like floodwater. The democratic government seemed helpless, fractured, weak. Into that vacuum, he strode, no longer an obscure agitator, but the leader of a disciplined, fanatical movement. His party's stormtroopers, the SA, filled streets with brown uniforms and fists. His speeches filled halls with hysteria. He promised jobs, pride, revenge, unity. He blamed the Republic for the nation's suffering, blamed Jews, communists, foreigners, decadent elites. People who would never have listened to him in times of comfort now clung to his words in desperation. In 1933, a deal was struck in smoke-filled rooms. Conservatives thought they could control him, use his popularity, tame his radicalism. They handed him the chancellorship. They believed he would be a pawn. He knew he would be the player. Soon after, the Reichstag burned, the German parliament building, flames licking at the night sky, the smell of ash and soaked wood. A lone Dutch communist was blamed, but the truth was buried in fear and confusion. He seized the moment. He claimed the fire was proof of a vast communist conspiracy. Under the guise of protecting the nation, he demanded emergency powers. Fear did the rest. The Enabling Act turned a fragile democracy into an empty shell. Parliament voted, some in terror, some in belief, to give him the right to rule by decree. No more balancing powers, no more meaningful opposition. Laws could now be written by his pen alone. He no longer had to convince. He could command. Power, once gained, was not shared. It was sharpened. The SS emerged. Black uniforms, skull badges, devotion not to law, but to him. The Gestapo listened at doors, opened letters, dragged people from their beds in the dead of night. Camps appeared, first for political opponents, communists, social democrats, anyone who dared to resist. Step by step, the machinery of terror clicked into place. Trade unions were crushed. Other parties dissolved. Judges were replaced or intimidated. Newspapers censored or shut down. People learned to speak in whispers, if at all. And always, that relentless drumbeat. The Jews, the Jews, the Jews. The Nuremberg laws carved them out of the nation legally, stripping citizenship, banning marriages, turning neighbors into aliens overnight. Science was twisted into racism. Posters showed caricatures and lies. Children were taught to hate in classrooms. I watched families shrink under the weight of it all. Storefronts defaced. Friends crossing streets to avoid being seen talking to each other. A slow, suffocating isolation. Then came Kristallnacht. November 1938, glass shattered like rain across German cities. Synagogues burned, flames clawing at the sky. Shops smashed. Men dragged into the street, beaten while the world stared through their curtains. It was a message, not just to Jews, to everyone. This is what happens when a lie is repeated long enough. It becomes permission. War, when it finally came, felt less like a sudden event and more like the inevitable crash after a long fall. Poland. He wanted land, living space, and he believed the world would not stop him. He had watched Europe hesitate, compromise, fold. Now he moved. Tanks rolled. Bombs fell. Poland was crushed between his armies and the Soviets. The invasion was swift, brutal. Villages reduced to rubble, civilians driven from their homes. Soldiers executed in ditches, blitzkrieg they called it, lightning war. Soon, it wasn't just Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France. Armies that once seemed unbeatable collapsed in weeks, sometimes days. His popularity in Germany soared with every victory. Crowds roared his name under banners, as if war were a sporting event and he their champion. Only Britain refused to bend. The Luftwaffe bombed London and other cities night after night. I watched searchlights comb the sky, heard bombs scream toward the earth. Firestorms consumed streets. Yet the island held. It was his. First real check, but his eyes were already turning. East at Operation Barbarossa, he unleashed the largest invasion the world had seen. Millions of men driving into the Soviet Union, believing it would be another quick victory. He saw Eastern Europe not just as territory, but as a racial battleground behind the front lines. Special units followed, the Einsatzgruppen, tasked not with defeating armies but with annihilating people. Jews, Roma, political officers, entire villages, driven into forests, ravines, fields, told to dig, told to undress, told to stand at the edge. Shots. Silence. Earth, shovel scraped over bodies still twitching. What had begun as discrimination became extermination. The camps expanded. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and others, industrialized killing centers. Trains arrived day and night. Families separated to the left, to the right, some to forced labor, most to gas chambers disguised as showers. The smoke that rose from those chimneys was the final form of his ideology. He had always spoken of cleansing, purifying, erasing. Now he was doing it, and the world, for too long, looked away. But war has its own logic, and hubris has its price. Winter closed its fist around the Eastern Front. German soldiers, ill-prepared, froze in their trenches. Supplies faltered. The distances became endless. The Soviet Union did not collapse. It adapted, endured, hit back. Stalingrad became the turning point, a city reduced to rubble and blood. Street to street, room to room, men fought for piles of bricks. German forces were encircled, cut off. I watched generals beg for permission to break out, retreat, survive. He refused. No retreat. No surrender. No reality but his own. Entire armies were swallowed in the snow. Prisoners marched into captivity, gaunt and broken. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological fracture. The myth of his invincibility died there, among the ruins. In North Africa, at El Alamein, his forces were pushed back. In Italy, the Allies landed, the Axis cracked. In the West, the noose was tightening even before D-Day. Then came June 6, 1944 D-Day. The Allied invasion of Normandy turned the western sky into a storm of planes and ships. Thousands of men hurled themselves onto fortified beaches. Sand turned red. Bodies floated in the surf. Above them, the future shifted. He had always believed he could divide his enemies, buy time, exploit weakness. Now time was running out. He faced pressure from all sides. Soviets advancing from the east, Allies from the west, bombs falling from above. Cities that had once cheered him now burned for him. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin. Firestorms devoured entire neighborhoods. Civilians screamed in air raid shelters as the ceiling shook and dust rained from cracks like the first grains of a buried tomb. Inside his headquarters, he retreated deeper into fantasy. Paranoia became his new currency. He stopped trusting generals, replacing experienced leadership with blind loyalty. He dismissed bad news. Maps, not reality, dictated orders. He moved imaginary divisions that no longer existed. He raged at fate, betrayal, destiny, and some did indeed plot against him. July 20th, 1944. A bomb placed in a conference room. A brief flash. Splintered wood, smoke, screams. He survived, injured, shaken, but alive. He took this near death not as a sign of his vulnerability, but as proof of his chosen nature. Meanwhile, he unleashed a new wave of terror, arresting, torturing, hanging those suspected of involvement. Noose after noose tightened around necks. Bodies dangling from piano wire in silent rooms. Germany was coming apart. He could not save it, but he could drag it down with him. By 1945, Berlin was a dying animal, streets choked with rubble. Civilians scavenged for food in ruins. Children were handed rifles and told to defend street corners as if they could stop armies. The Soviets closed in from the east with artillery that made the earth itself tremble. The Allies from the west pressed toward the heart of the Reich. Bombs fell like punctuation marks on the end of a sentence written in blood. And he went underground. The Führer bunker, a concrete tomb beneath the chancellery. Stale air. Fluorescent lights, maps on walls no longer representing reality. I watched him there, his body a frail echo of the man who once commanded stadiums. His hand shook as he tried to hold a teacup. His hair had thinned, his eyes sunken, his gaze darting between fantasy and despair. He railed against generals who betrayed him, cursed the German people for not being worthy of him, issued orders to divisions that existed now only as lines on paper. Above him, Berlin burned, yet even at the end he remained trapped in the same delusions that had birthed his rise. No regret, no apology. Just a shrinking circle of loyalists, sycophants, and the woman who had followed him into the abyss, Eva Braun. She had been there for years, smiling in photographs, dancing in mountain retreats while others starved. In the bunker's claustrophobic halls, they finally did what they had never done in all the years of their entanglement. They married, a small ceremony absurdly formal for a world collapsing overhead. Champagne in chipped glasses, a bouquet in trembling hands. The priest's words nearly drowned out by distant artillery, a wedding in a grave. He dictated his last will and political testament, still blaming Jews, Bolsheviks, and the failures of others. Still insisting he had been right, that history would vindicate him. He clung to the same poisonous narrative he had fed a nation, one last propaganda piece written not to save lives, but to preserve his legend. Then came the end. April 30th, 1945. In a small, stark room deep in the bunker, he sat on a worn sofa. Eva beside him, the smell of stale smoke, sweat, and fear hung heavy. Outside, the Soviets were close enough for their guns to rattle light fixtures. Eva took poison. He put a pistol. To his head, a flash, a body slumped, a life ended. In the same violence he had spent years, inflicting on others. They carried him out into the courtyard above, surrounded by the ruins of the capital that had once celebrated him. Poured petrol, set fire. Flames licked at the remains as shells whistled. Overhead, the man who wanted to be a god became ash in a bomb crater. You might think, that's where the story ends. It isn't, because I told you at the beginning, I witnessed it all. Not as a man in a crowd, nor a soldier in the trenches, nor a guard at his door. I am something else. I am the echo in every speech where hatred is dressed up as patriotism. I'm the chill in every room where fear silences. Truth. I am the whisper that rises whenever people say, it can't happen here, and then begin to look away. I watched him grow from a wounded boy into a dictator. I watched millions follow him. Down a path they convinced themselves was destiny, and I am still watching, because his story is not just about him. It is about what happens when bitterness hardens into ideology, when failure seeks a scapegoat instead of responsibility, when a nation trades its doubts for certainty, its questions for slogans, its conscience for obedience. His life was a descent, a long, spiraling fall from a small Austrian town to a bunker beneath a dying city. Along the way, he dragged continents into war and millions into graves. He died believing he was right. But the world he left behind, the ruins, the testimonies, the bones, tell a different truth. So remember this. As I fade back into the dark, monsters do not appear fully formed. They are shaped by wounds, excuses, applause, by every small choice to look away, every quiet surrender. I witnessed the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. I tell you this not to haunt you with his shadow, but to remind you that shadows only grow when the light stops being defended. Guard that light, because somewhere, right now, another angry voice is learning how to turn a wound into a weapon, and another crowd is gathering, eager to listen.